So when I came to Korea, I noticed that not many people really know much about British culture. And they kind of often think of only America when they think about, film, books, music. And I want that to change. I really want people to appreciate that Britain, we have a much influence on the world of culture. So this is a map of Britain. It's such a small country, such a small island in the world, and yet since the 20th century, the culture which has emerged from this country has flourished. It's been massive, and I think that can largely be put down to the effect of the English language. Around the world, there is maybe as many as 1 billion people that speak English, which is incredible. It's such a small island, and yet it's the most spoken language in the world. There are 375 million people who speak it as a first language in countries such as the United States, New Zealand, Australia, Canada. There are many, and it's just incredible. And I think because of this, the culture has been allowed to flourish. So first of all, so how you can see here, this is the language. It's incredible that this language is the most spoken in the world. And these are the countries that speak it. You can see down in the corner there's Australia and New Zealand, there's Canada and the United States. Altogether, there are a lot of the world is English speaking. That's incredible. First of all, we'll talk about the music. I think probably the most famous band to emerge from England is undoubtedly the Beatles. And they were probably pioneers of music. Many of the things which we now take for granted today in the world of music, such as the long play form, they were pioneered by the Beatles. Here are just some of their albums, and many of their songs, they're just part of the popular culture of the world. They came around in 1962 from my city, Liverpool, in England, and at the time, they were just an enormous cultural, global phenomenon, unlike anything which had ever been seen before. Beatlemania was the term which was used to describe them, and it spread around the globe. But they weren't just popular for their looks, and pretty soon they became popular because of their talents as songwriters. And as their career progressed, they used many different styles and really pioneered the industry. They're the best-selling band in history. They've sold over 1 billion records. And over their 12 albums, which were released between 1962 and 1970. Rolling Stone magazine, one of the biggest music magazines in the world, ranked Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is in the top left, as the best album of all time. And it also ranked Revolver and Rubber Soul as the 3rd and 5th best album of all time. From one band in all of the history of music to have such an enormous impact is just unprecedented and truly one of a kind. After the Beatles were another great British band, which were a little different, the Rolling Stones. They have been called the greatest rock and roll band in the history of the world, and they themselves have sold more than 200 million albums. Their album Exile on Main Street was ranked by the same American magazine, Rolling Stone, as the 7th greatest of all time. And again, from such a small island, we've had enormous impact upon the world. And the Rolling Stone magazine, it's not the same as the Rolling Stones, but they ranked the Rolling Stones as the 4th greatest artists of all time, behind the Beatles, who were naturally number 1, Elvis Presley and Bob Dylan. Just enormous, very famous names. After the Rolling Stones, another very different band, Led Zeppelin. They are called often the greatest rock band of all time, and they, many people think, invented many parts of music. The heavy metal genre was kind of pioneered by them. After Led Zeppelin was Pink Floyd, whose album The Dark Side of the Moon, which was released in 1973, sold more than 50 million copies, and it's one of the most commercially successful albums of all time. And also Led Zeppelin's song Stairway to Heaven is one of the most famous songs of all time, and often cited as being the greatest rock track of all time. There was also Dire Straits, who came along a little afterwards. They are another of the most successful bands of all time. They've sold over 120 million albums, and again, one of the most successful bands in the history of the world, which is incredible. After them, again in the 1980s, came David Bowie, another pioneer of the genre, another pioneer of music. He has sold more than 140 million albums, and he was ranked as another of the greatest artists of all time by Rolling Stone magazine. His career was wide-ranging and included many collaborations, and he delved into many different genres. One collaboration was with Queen, who you can see in the bottom left corner there, Freddie Mercury, the iconic frontman of the band. At the peak of their powers, they were considered one of the greatest stadium rock bands in the world, and they confirmed their immortality in 1985 when they played at Live Aid, which was sort of a charity concert held to raise money for Africans. It was one of the biggest TV broadcasts of all time, and more than 1.9 billion people watched it. I think it's around 1/3 of the world watched Live Aid across 150 nations in the world. Incredible numbers. And Queen's performance, in the bottom left corner, you can see Freddie Mercury again. It's often considered the greatest live performance of all time. It was just incredible in that it launched Queen, and it really brought the message of Africa to the world. And they were pioneers of that. They also wrote the song Bohemian Rhapsody, which is often named as just one of the greatest songs of all time. It's a karaoke classic. I love singing it myself at Noribon. Bohemian Rhapsody is very fun. Again, though, in the 1990s, the style of music emerging from Britain changed, and we had the Spice Girls. The Spice Girls came. I'm not a fan myself of the Spice Girls, but I'm sure many people are. They came around in 1994, and they found success a couple of years later with their song Wannabe, which hit #1 in more than 30 countries and established the group as a global phenomenon, which was one of the first times that this had happened since the Beatles. So in many ways, they're quite different to the Beatles, but also similar in a few. And I think it's amazing. They sold more than 28 million copies of their first album worldwide. And it's quite a shocking fact that many of you might not believe, they became the greatest selling female group of all time. Greater than all of the Motown girl groups that were around in the 1960s. It's phenomenal. And altogether, they sold 75 million records. And as I said, they were the most successful British band since the Beatles, which I've mentioned all of these names which came after the Beatles. I think it's quite shocking, but quite impressive that there's such a range of music which emerged from the country. But at the same time as the Spice Girls, we also had Britpop, which became very popular around the world. And you can see Oasis in the bottom left corner. Again, not my taste, but they were very popular around the world in this genre. It's quite distinctive of the 90s. Many people think of the 1990s as being the era of Britpop. And we also have Radiohead in the bottom right there, another great British band who pioneered many forms of music, and a lot of people think that some of their records are some of the best since the Beatles. It's often cited as such. Radiohead, again, were called by Rolling Stone magazine one of the greatest bands of all time, up there with the likes of the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd. All of these names I've mentioned before, we continue to produce, and they continue to have an impact around the world. But then into the 2000s, another shift in the style of music, not just in Britain, but all around the world. And we had Amy Winehouse, who created a new genre of music almost, which then led to the fame of the likes of Lady Gaga and many others like her. She had great success with her second album, Back to Black, which was nominated for 6 Grammy Awards, and she managed to win 5 of them. And then following in her footsteps was another British artist, Adele, who was quite similar in many ways to Amy Winehouse, but some would say that she improved upon the style that Amy Winehouse created herself. In 2012, her album 21 became a smash hit everywhere around the world, and she won 6 Grammy Awards, which are considered the greatest achievement in music in terms of awards, including Album of the Year. And in the United States, her album, 21, held the top position in the charts, the Billboard charts, for longer than any other album since 1985. It's 35 years that it's completely exceeded anything which had been achieved in that time, which is incredible. And Time magazine one of the most popular, the most respected magazines in the world, ranked Adele as being one of the most influential people in the world at this time. So she's just 21 years old, I think, and she's had this enormous impact upon the world. It's unprecedented. After Adele, and to this day, we have another popular British band, again, not so much to my taste, in One Direction. They are very popular at the moment. They were formed on a British TV talent show, and they have sold over 15 million units, and many of them aren't even 20 years old yet. I don't think any of them are. They're all in their teens still. And their latest album, which was released just a few weeks ago, is at the top, or debuted at the top of the charts in 32 countries around the world. Again, very similar to the Beatles in that their impact spread throughout the world, and they're very popular amongst teenage girls, I think, which is again the same as the Beatles, so you could probably compare them to the Beatles in that way. Maybe not any other ways, but that's it. But we continue to produce such amazing talent, which just pioneers many forms of music. So, but then outside of music, there's also British cinema, which is very popular around the world also. But a lot of people don't really appreciate that what they watch, what they take in, what they consume is actually British in many ways. And many of the popular British films, many of the most successful films in the world were from Britain. And here you can see just a few of the characters who have emerged from Great Britain, from this small island. The biggest star of the early cinematic era was Charlie Chaplin, and his character, the tramp, who you can see his classic look on the right-hand side there, is one of the most recognizable characters in the history of film. And this was before World War I that he first came about, and at that time he was the most famous film star in the world. But then the advent of talkies came around, the advent of cinema with sound, and one of the biggest names at the early time was Alfred Hitchcock. He, like many of the musicians who came before, he pioneered many techniques, and some say he created the thriller genre, which we now love today. It's my favorite genre, and many of his films are just absolute classics. For example, Vertigo, which you can see the poster for in the middle. It was voted by Sight and Sound magazine this year as the greatest film of all time. And that was the first time in the history of the magazine that Citizen Kane was not considered the #1 film. So this, again, small film, small country, huge impact upon the world. And he's also made many other classic films. There's The 39 Steps, Rebecca, Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, North by Northwest, which you can see there. All classics of the genre, and often many of them are cited as the best of all time. After Hitchcock, whose career actually lasted a long time, over half a century, came a more all-round British character in Laurence Olivier. He was a true all-rounder. He was a celebrated and lauded writer, director, actor, and his impact was so widespread. He is often even regarded as being the greatest actor of his era, of the 20th century, with so many huge names. That's such an impressive fact that people consider him such. He was nominated for 12 Academy Awards, and he won 2 for his role in Hamlet, which he also wrote and directed. Well, he adapted. It was the first non-American film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, which is quite phenomenal. The British film, created by Laurence Olivier, adapted from a British play, it's had an enormous effect. And I think this image in the bottom left is just so famous of Hamlet there, Laurence Olivier. And after Laurence Olivier, another British actor who is often cited as being the most all-round, the best leading man of all time, Cary Grant. And here you can see him in North by Northwest, the Hitchcock classic. He was named by the American Film Institute, so this is an American publication, as being the second greatest film star of all time. Which, again, coming from England, you would not expect him to have an impact in America, who famously favour their own. So for him to be considered the second greatest frontman of all time, it's a phenomenal statistic. And he's remembered for his roles in movies such as Bringing Up Baby, His Girl Friday, To Catch a Thief and A Fur to Remember, and North by Northwest, one of the greatest films of all time, I think. But as Hitchcock's career drew to a close, as it's encompassed all of this era, came another great British director in David Lean, who may not be as famous a name as Alfred Hitchcock, but he had such a wide-ranging career and his films are so well remembered that I think more people should appreciate that these films that you can see here, Dr. Zhivago, The Bridge on the River Kwai, Lawrence of Arabia, they were all created by this British genius, David Lean. As with Hitchcock, he's often named as being one of the greatest directors of all time, and Lawrence of Arabia, his masterpiece, his magnum opus, was named as the 5th greatest film of all time by American Film Institute. Again, this British film, produced entirely in Britain, is named by an American publication as being the 5th greatest film of all of the genres. It's a phenomenal statistic. The film was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, and it won 7 of them, including Best Picture and Best Director for David Lean, who I think should be remembered as one of the true greats of cinema. And his style of all of these films were epics, and his style is now felt in the works of Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas. All of the big names in cinema today, they have David Lean to thank. He created the genre. But then after, or during the career of David Lean, came a much different character who I think is still famous today. Everybody thinks of him as being the prototypical British male, unfortunately. It's James Bond. Unfortunately, we're not all like James Bond. I wish we could be sometimes. And his charm, his looks, his tuxedo, many people think of him as being the standard British man, like I say. And his first film was in 1962, Dr. No. It's quite different. Well, the series changed over time to be quite different. In the beginning, it was a spy caper, but it became more and more kind of slapstick. But it's changed, and recently, in fact just a couple of weeks ago, came the 23rd installment of the series in Skyfall, which it's taken more of a shift back to the original style of James Bond, and it's famous and it's respected, it's critically acclaimed for its aspects of thriller. And it was released over a month ago, or around a month ago. It's already grossed around $800 million worldwide. It's fast becoming one of the greatest selling films of the last few years. And altogether, the James Bond films, which as I mentioned were 23, are the second highest grossing film series of all time, everywhere in the world. They've made over $5.6 billion altogether, the second greatest, like I said. The next character to emerge, I had a little problem including him because he's not British, but in the 1960s he settled in England. It's Stanley Kubrick. He's obviously, like I said, he's American, but he settled in England in the 1960s, and it was here in England that he produced many of his best films. 2001: A Space Odyssey, Dr. Strangelove, Clockwork Orange, they were all produced in England and written and directed by Stanley Kubrick while he was living in England. So I consider them part of English culture, part of British culture. Maybe that's not a popular opinion. He's a classic American director, but I think my opinion is more important. And his film Dr. Strangelove starred Peter Sellers, who famously took 3 roles in the film. It's a classic performance, 3 much distinct roles in this one film. Peter Sellers, another great British actor to emerge from the country. 2001: A Space Odyssey, often considered one of the all-time greats of any genre. It's very iconic, and the soundtrack to it is also incredibly iconic. I'm not sure many people even appreciate that these films were all produced in England. They're all English culture. They're part of the culture of my country. A Clockwork Orange came after 2001, and it's adapted from another British novel. It was highly controversial at the time, but it kind of highlights just how diverse Stanley Kubrick's films were. Each of these 3 films is so different to each other, so distinct. Clockwork Orange was, like I say, very controversial. It was one of the taglines for the film was something about ultra-violence. It's incredibly violent, incredibly surreal. It's supposed to be about a dystopian society living in the future, but it's incredibly influential at the same time. and it starred another British actor, Malcolm McDowell, who you can see there in the middle. I think the picture in the poster is very iconic, and many people think of it as one of the most iconic film posters of all time. But another very different group to Stanley Kubrick and all of these directors that I've mentioned came next. It's Monty Python. These films, The Holy Grail and The Life of Brian, they're often thought of as being some of the greatest comedies of all time. And this group, they formed at a university, and I can't actually remember which university. It was either Oxford or Cambridge. They were very intelligent writers, very ahead of their times. The films were so popular around the world. They marked such a shift from everything which had been witnessed before. Still to this day, if you watch these films, you just can't help but just be in hysterics the whole way through. It's just genius, a work of genius in comedy. After Monty Python, or around the same time as them, came another very different director in Ridley Scott, one of the greats of the sci-fi genre, but he's also found success outside of this genre. Gladiator, which was released in the year 2000, was a huge global hit, and it swept at the Academy Awards, and directed by this man from Newcastle in England, Ridley Scott. He also directed Blade Runner, one of the classic films of the sci-fi genre, Alien, and this year's Prometheus, which was very successful, very critically acclaimed. So his career has spanned more than 30 years, but he's still at the height of his powers. He's still managing to produce these incredibly popular, incredibly stylish films in the sci-fi genre and outside of it. Altogether, his films have been nominated for a total of 31 Academy Awards, and he's won 9 of them. After Ridley Scott, another very distinct director, Danny Boyle. His film Trainspotting, which came around in 1996, was very popular around the world. It was kind of created the indie genre, which became popular in the 90s. But after that, he had success with 28 Days Later, 127 Hours, and Slumdog Millionaire, which, when it was released in 2008, it had huge success around the world. And it was another British film which swept at the Academy Awards. It was nominated for 10 awards, and it won 8, including Best Picture and Best Director, for Mr. Danny Boyle from a small town near Manchester. It's a great success for Britain. And after Boyle was Christopher Nolan. Many people, I'm sure, have seen the films: The Dark Knight, Batman Begins, Inception, Memento, The Prestige, but I'm not sure that they realise that the genius behind these films is Christopher Nolan. He's British, and he truly is a genius. And I personally, and I'm sure many others like me, consider him to be, at the moment, the greatest director and one of the greatest writers in the world. He's achieved the enormous feat of producing not only critically acclaimed films, but also commercially successful films. And his directorial efforts over such a small number of films have grossed over $3.5 billion worldwide, and they've been nominated for 21 Academy Awards. At the same time as Christopher Nolan, another enormously successful British character, Harry Potter. And you may not realise this, but it is actually the #1 highest grossing film series of all time. More than any other series in the world, over the 8 films, they have grossed over $7.7 billion. An enormous amount. So I told you that James Bond was the second highest grossing series, over 23 films. Harry Potter is the highest grossing, over only 8. That's an incredible statistic. All of the films, they were produced entirely in England, starring an almost completely British cast, and they were adapted from the famous British books, which we will discuss a little later. So even today, we're still producing very successful films that are having such an enormous impact around the world. And I think people are often, unlike with music, with film, maybe they're often not aware that the films that they see that are part of the popular culture, of the psyche around the world, they're British. And maybe if you can appreciate that today, then I would be a little happier, because I don't think British people and the British culture gets enough credit around the world. But after British film, we'll move on to British literature. And with the other topics, I tried to discuss more contemporary, more to this day, but it's impossible to talk about British literature without going a little bit into the past. Because of the first name, William Shakespeare, the greatest dramatist of all time, one of the greatest writers, if not the greatest writer. He's had such an enormous influence, even in the world of the English language. Just a few of his quotes here from his plays. I think it's just incredible how many of these, I think people don't even realize they're from Shakespeare. They're just part of the language. To be or not to be, that is the question. People don't think of it as being Shakespeare. It's just a quote. It's a phrase that people say now. It's phenomenal. He was alive in the 16th century, and that's such a long time ago, but still today, his plays are still discussed and interpreted, studied everywhere around the world. And he is the most translated. All of his plays have been translated into every living language, every major living language around the world. And he wrote 38 plays, around that number. Some people think maybe more, but a lot of his plays may be missing. And they include such classics as Hamlet, which we already mentioned, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, many more. There's just so many great names, classics of the literature genre, of literature, still studied and still interpreted today everywhere around the world. Not just in England, not just in the English language, but in every language they're studied and interpreted. And also, predating the modern era, were other authors such as Charles Dickens, Daniel Defoe, Jane Austen, Lewis Carroll. And Dickens' novel, A Tale of Two Cities, is the highest-selling novel of all time anywhere in the world. It sold approximately 200 million copies, and like I say, it's the highest-selling novel, which was it was released in the 19th century, but still to this day, it's so famous. The first line from the book, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It's such a part of popular culture, of the psyche of the world. Daniel Defoe, he authored Robinson's Crusoe, which many people cite as being the first of the novel form. So he was another true pioneer of culture. Lewis Carroll, Jane Austen, like I say, they were also around this time. Lewis Carroll authored Alice in Wonderland, which is an incredibly popular book still to this day. Jane Austen, author of many novels, including Emma, like you can see there. But then getting into the modern era, so more to this present day, you can still see that British artists still have an impact. First is Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle was from Scotland, and he wrote first Sherlock Holmes in the 19th century, the late 19th century, but still to this day, an enormous part of popular culture. I mean, even in just the last 5 years, there have been 2 Hollywood adaptations, massive blockbusters, enormously successful around the world, as well as at least 2 TV series, which have been adapted from his novels. Guinness World Records lists Sherlock Holmes as being the most portrayed movie character of all time. There have been over 70 actors who have played the role of Sherlock Holmes, and his famous silhouette there, I think it's quite iconic with his pipe, and he's just a famous detective. After Arthur Conan Doyle, moving into the 20th century, the first name is George Orwell, maybe my favourite author of all time. In many ways similar to Shakespeare, in that his works have had an enormous impact upon the English language, and many of his phrases, of the words which he coined, have become part of the English language, such as doublethink, thought police, Big Brother, which you can see there, it's Room 101. There are just many things which he created which have had an impact upon the world. And his 2 books, 1984, which you can see on the left, and Animal Farm, together they have sold more copies than any other 2 books written by the same author in the 20th century. And actually, I think 1984, for a long period of time, was banned in the United States. I'm not sure about that, but I think that just shows just how, even with that, it's one of the highest-selling books of all time. It's really just genius. My favourite book of all time, personally. And after George Orwell and his deep, his more His books were more supposed to be referencing the times. So 1984 and Animal Farm kind of reference communism. So a little lighter than George Orwell is Roald Dahl, and he's one of the world's best-selling authors. His works include James and the Giant Peach, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Matilda, Fantastic Mr. Fox, the BFG, and he was born in Wales. And even today, these characters are very iconic and still produced. As with many of the other British novelists, the films are regularly adapted into Hollywood blockbusters. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory just a few years ago was a Hollywood blockbuster starring Johnny Depp. And it's a really great set of books written by this genius, a true pioneer of children's books. After Roald Dahl came Agatha Christie, who is the highest-selling, the best-selling author in the history of the world. Her books have sold more than any other author in any language from anywhere in the world, and her book, And Then There Were None, has sold over 100 million copies, and it's one of the best-selling books of all time. She is also the most translated individual author. Her books have been translated into more languages than any other author, over 103 languages at least, which is very impressive for this pioneer of the detective genre. And you can see two of her characters, Poirot and Miss Marple, very famous detectives, and very good novels. After her came JRR Tolkien, true in every sense of the word, a pioneer of the fantasy genre. He created the Lord of the Rings, which is enormously successful. It has sold over 150 million copies, and it's the third highest selling book of all time. He also wrote The Hobbit, which itself sold over 100 million copies, and he's often called, Mr. Tolkien, the father of modern literature, of modern fantasy literature. And many other authors who are popular around the world today, they cite Tolkien as their biggest influence. And in a couple of weeks, I think 2 weeks today, The Hobbit is to be released around the world, a Hollywood adaptation with a budget of over $150 million. It's directed by the same genius behind the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, which was released 10 years ago. And I'm sure it's bound to be an enormous critical and commercial success, as well as that it will reaffirm Tolkien's position as such an enormous superpower amongst culture around the world. These books, they were published around 50 years ago, 60 years ago, but today, as you can see, they're still being adapted into films. They're still being read and taken in and studied around the world by this little writer from Wales, a little tiny country in the British Isles. But after Tolkien, one author who cites Tolkien as such a massive influence to her, who I'm sure you all know, is JK Rowling. Her books, Harry Potter, we have already mentioned. They've been adapted into the highest-selling film series of all time. And the 7 books, which were released first, the first one in 1997, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and the last 10 years later, The Deathly Hallows, have become the best-selling book series in history. So not only the best-selling film series, but also the best-selling book series. They sold approximately 450 million copies around the world. And they've been translated into 67 languages, and they've gained immense popularity, critical acclaim, and enormous, unprecedented commercial success. The last 4 books, starting with The Goblet of Fire, they consecutively set records as the fastest-selling books in history. And they've not only been adapted into films, but they've also seen things such as theme parks in America created in the image. You can go to Hogwarts, the school that he attended. You can live it. You can be Harry Potter if you want. And even today, there are more and more British authors. There's another who, I'm not sure if you know 50 Shades of Grey. It's become this year one of the most successful books of all time, written by a British author. But I won't go into that book because I'm not sure if it's the right audience for it. So you can see here, it's such a small country, but such an enormous impact. And I hope that after today's talk, maybe you might be able to appreciate a little more that the world is not only influenced by America, British culture, I don't know why I'm talking to myself, not me, but the British people, they've managed to have an enormous impact on the world. I've told you about the Beatles, pioneers in the music genre. I've told you about William Shakespeare, the pioneer in literature, a true genius. I told you about James Bond, Harry Potter, all of these characters, some of the highest selling, the most successful in their fields of all time, they're all British. And I think I'm so proud of that myself, and I hope that other British people are proud to come from this country. Such a great country with a rich culture. Anyway, thank you very much for your time.
So now it's time for the Q&A portion of the talk. If you didn't receive a piece of paper when you came in, please raise your hand and one of our volunteers can give you one. Please write your question on the paper and hand it back to the volunteer, and they will bring it to me and I will ask the questions to the speaker. Please don't raise your hand to ask questions directly to the speaker. So, David, excellent talk. Let's start off with some more about you personally. So, how did you make your way from England, a country that you clearly have a lot of affection for?
Yeah.
How did you make your way to Korea?
Actually, I guess you could say I was a little bit disillusioned by England, a little bit unsure of it. It wasn't until I came to Korea that I really realized just how great Britain is, truly. It's from talking to other people in Korea I've become aware of how proud I am for all of these things that I've mentioned. But I came over because I studied English at university. I wanted to do something which kind of made use of my degree, you know. And there isn't really much you can do with a degree in English in England, unfortunately. So I came over to Korea. I heard a lot of good things, and I absolutely love it here. It's such a great country, and you know I want to stay for many years.
Okay. And when did you arrive in?
Not long ago, only 3 months ago yesterday, actually. So I'm still a newbie, but
wow.
I'm trying to experience it all, take as much in as I can, you know.
Okay, you did mention that you have a favorite book, and we'll come back to that. But you talked about other media as well. So, do you have a favorite British band?
I do. I've mentioned them only briefly, but I thought I had to include them. Radiohead are my favorite band. But I also love the Beatles. I think it's kind of a necessity as a British person to love the Beatles. When I was brought up, I was constantly listening to the Beatles. My mum would always play Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club whenever we drove anywhere, and so for as long as I can remember, I've been a fan of the Beatles. But as I grew older, so many other bands entered my life. You know, Radiohead, they're just an enormous band to me, and it just so happens they're British. I would like them even if they weren't.
So, you mentioned the Beatles and many other bands that came afterwards, up to One Direction. So, you mentioned that there's a difference between, say, the Beatles and One Direction, and not just in England,
right,
but everywhere there's been maybe a shift from artists
right,
who write their own music and perform their own music, like the Beatles,
right,
to people who are more like performers, like One Direction. Do you have an opinion about that?
Actually, yeah, I do. Yeah, that's something I think about quite a lot. And since coming to Korea, I've been listening to a lot of K-pop. And one K-pop group that I really respected for this reason are Beast, because I heard that Beast, they not only perform their own songs, but they write all of their own material. And I think that, you know, going back to the Beatles, they had this image of being such superstars, but they also were geniuses. You know, they had brains and they wrote everything, this pioneering music. And so they had the skills, they had the talent to sing, to play the guitar, but they also had the ability, the creativity to write everything. And you know, it's like I say, I hugely respect artists that can also write them. Like Michael Jackson, an American artist, he wrote all of his own material, and I respect him for that even more than him being an incredibly influential singer.
So you talked about the Beatles and Beatlemania.
Right.
So what is the hottest icon among British teenagers today?
It's undoubtedly One Direction. Yeah, definitely. I think not even amongst British teenagers, that around the world, if you go on social network sites like Twitter, it's just dominated by One Direction. And Justin Bieber as well, he's another, but unfortunately not British, or fortunately, you might say. One Direction, though, they're just enormous amongst teenagers. Everybody loves One Direction who is a teenager.
So you mentioned sort of the fact that One Direction is a bunch of attractive teenagers, so that explains some of the reason of their success. But why do you think that Britain has been so successful and influential in culture in general? What is it about British culture?
Well, I kind of glossed over it a little beginning of the talk. I think that the English language is the key thing, and I think in the past couple of hundred years, the British Empire dominated the world, and it was called the empire where the sun never set. The sun never sets because there was always one part of the British Empire where it was day, and everywhere in the British Empire, rightfully or wrongfully, we forced the natives to learn English. Well, wrongfully, I suppose you could say. And but many of them, they still speak English today. India, Nigeria, these countries which obviously they didn't speak English before we came, they now speak it, and because of that, they are immersed into English culture. Everything which we created, it became a part of them, And I think it's easy for it to spread around the world when the language is shared. Like I said, it's the most widely spoken language in the world, the English language. More than 1 billion people speak it. And America, I think, is probably classically considered to be the most influential on world culture, but Great Britain, considering it's kind of relatively small, still an enormous impact. I think it's even bigger than its size.
So you mentioned that you think part of the reason that British culture has been so successful in spreading in the past was the extent of the British Empire. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that the UK has lost some of its cultural influence to the US? Right. Is it in conjunction with the decline in British military and political influence?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah, I guess America at the moment is the biggest superpower in the world, and as such, it's easy for the rest of the world to consume American culture, American media. I mean, I know myself, I just take it in all the time. Every film I watch pretty much is American. All of the music that's on the radio is American because they're such... Everybody wants to kind of emulate America these days. Everybody wants to, be seen to be similar to them, and it's easy. One easy way to do that is to take their culture, take it on board. And maybe a couple of hundred years ago, Britain would have been like that. Everybody may have wanted to emulate Britain, but nowadays I think it's, you have to be realistic and say that everybody wants to be America, unfortunately.
So let's go back in time a little bit to your discussion of British literature. Mm-hmm. So you talked, of course, about how influential Shakespeare has mm-hmm. been. Can you talk a little bit specifically about Shakespeare's influence on the development of the English language?
Right. Well, actually, many of the terms that Shakespeare used, they weren't even part of the language. He just coined them to fit in. I think, I'm not an expert on literature, but his writing was on prose, or at least some of it. So he kind of he shaped the language in his plays and in his poems to fit into the prose. So in order for things to rhyme, he maybe moved it around in sentences. But because it's become so consumed, and we all know everything about Shakespeare, we all know Shakespeare, it became kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because he wrote it, it became the truth, it became the norm to use these words, these phrases, which, I mean, when I was in school, we read Romeo and Juliet, we watched Hamlet, Othello, and I can remember the phrases which I put on the screen. I can remember them having a huge influence on me, and me thinking, wow, to be or not to be, that is the question. I remember thinking, yeah, that's genius.
You mentioned the numbers of English speakers in the world, mm-hmm. and some of our previous talks in the GIC talk series have talked about different kinds of English. Right. So I think that's part of the spread of English culture, is the spread of English language as well.
Yeah.
How do you feel about these different Englishes that are developing in parts of the world as part of the spread of British culture, such as recently there was a news article about Hinglish mm-hmm. in India.
Yeah.
How do you feel about these different Englishes?
Well, I think it's only natural. Language is it's an ever-changing entity. It's always evolving. I mean, when I was at university, I studied Old English and Middle English. So these were languages which were spoken in England maybe around 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago for Middle English. And they are so different to modern English. So it's to be expected that as language crosses the world, as more people consume it, it's going to change. And it's easy for somebody who speaks two languages to assimilate between the languages and to use different parts. So maybe the nouns they use would be English, but the structure of sentences might be the same as in Hindu. I think it's just to be expected. I think I like it. I like that language is changing, and I'm proud of it. I'm proud that people want to speak English, even if it does mean that they assimilate, they use features of their own language.
Okay. So someone has a question about someone that's another prominent bit of English entertainment, but maybe not as illustrious as some of the examples you mentioned. Somebody mentioned that Mr. Bean is useful in the ESL classroom, the slapstick comedy, without much in the way of spoken language to get in the way of understanding. Do you have an opinion of the comedy of Mr. Bean?
Well, I remember when I was growing up, I always watched Mr. Bean, and I think I read that the reason it's so successful is because it can be consumed everywhere in the world without the need to translate. Like you say, it doesn't have any, or at least much language in it. So people in Korea, they can watch Mr. Bean, and I guess slapstick comedy is a global form of comedy. Everybody can find it funny when he misinterprets something bad happens. And it's kind of a British thing, I suppose. Mr. Bean is, in many ways, prototypical of British comedy. I think it's pretty funny.
Okay. Now you mentioned that 1984 is your favorite book.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us why 1984 is your favorite book?
I guess I first read 1984 when I was in school, maybe like 14 or 15, and at that time the only books I'd read were like Harry Potter, books like that, which they don't really have much of a reference point to the real world. Whereas at the same time as reading 1984, I was studying the Soviet Union and communism, and I found it really interesting that this whole world existed kind of behind the Iron Curtain. And in 1984, George Orwell kind of the setting is as if communism has taken over the world, and it's such a dystopian way of living where everybody's being watched, everybody's move is being followed, and nobody can live their lives normal. And I think it's just fascinating to think that at the time when 1984 was written, I think it was published in 1948, it was a very real possibility that the world in 1984 could have been like that. Also the way in which George Orwell writes, at the time as he was writing it, he had tuberculosis, but he still managed to write this incredible book, and it just blows my mind that he could have such an impact, and his writing is just incredible. The way he writes kind of makes you picture everything so vividly, so perfectly, and the language is just brilliant. Like I mentioned the times like Room 101, Big Brother, Double Thing, they're just all parts of the world these days. It's phenomenal.
Okay, so this will be our final question for today. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, please feel free to address the speaker directly after the talk. So, David, you managed to co-opt Stanley Kubrick into an American into your British pantheon.
Right.
So can you, however, you also seem to include some works that involved British people, but were maybe Hollywood films or British expats who relocated to America. So can you maybe clarify exactly what you mean when you say British culture?
Right, okay. Well, I think for movies, the film industry is such a global thing now that it's impossible to pinpoint any one film or any one story as being specifically one thing. So I kind of tried to just think of the dominating thing. So Harry Potter, it's definitely British. All of the actors speak with British voices. James Bond, he's definitely British. Ridley Scott, on the other hand, his films like Blade Runner that stars Harrison Ford, he's an American actor. So if you watch that, you might think that it's an American film, but the biggest voice in the film is that of Ridley Scott. he is the one who's had the impact upon the film. He is the genius that created it. So whilst it may sound American, it's British. You know, I try to just think about if the British voice was strong within the whichever form I mentioned. So, like I say, it's difficult to get something which is absolutely British, but if it has a little bit of British or a lot, then I'm going to take it. You know, I'm going to be happy with it.
Perfect. Thank you for the clarification. So